Hello friends. So today let's see how arrow function is useful in JavaScript. So in this scenario, let me show you first how we create a function in JavaScript. So let's say we have a function const foo equal to function, and then we are defining this function. Let's say console.log hello. So now let me run this function. Now let's run it. So as you see, hello is printed. So now this is a normal function. Now let's see how the ESX syntax function with arrow function will looks like. So here you can see over here I have already taken a snippet. So let me show you this one. So as you can see, the foo function, instead of using this function, we have this particular arrow which will be implemented to modify the function, and this is how we can transform the function. So if we have a single line, then we can do like this. Like we can see, we can do something. We just have to remove this, and then you have to remove arrow, add arrow, sorry, and then this function will be there. So let me run this one. Let me show you how to see that, and let me comment this out for now, and let me show you this one. This is the arrow function. So this one, run it. The hello is coming as expected. Now let me show you one more thing is, let's say if you have only one line to write over here, so you don't have this, you don't need to use this particular curly braces. You just put it in one liner, and then let's try to run it. It's again printing hello. So this is how arrow function works in ESX syntax. So now you might be having a question in your mind, like what's the purpose for arrow function if it looks similar to the normal function? But let me tell you, it's not so simple. Like in this scenario, you're talking about it like as if that there is no change in the result. But let me show you, and let me try to explain you like how and what's the benefit arrow function gives in ESX syntax. So here is a arrow function over here. So as you can see over here, so let me tell you one thing about, like there are two terminologies. One is lexical scoping and one is dynamic scoping. A kind of there is a slight difference between the word like scoping and environment, but for now just think about it like there is a particular environment in which a particular things has been defined, so and how it's been arranged. So let's say over here, when we're talking about calling a function which is called over here, it is called on a globally on this particular window. So in browser we talk about as a window, and when we go for server side things like Node.js, we will talk about it like a global. Global is a global variable over there, and in our normal console we can see window as a global variable. So now let me explain you one thing. Like for this scenario, we have this particular variable a. So what will happen, this variable a is accessible within this particular function. It won't be accessible outside this particular function. So that means its environment is within this function, and this kind of scenario is called lexical environment. So when we are talking about lexical environment, then we are talking about the place where it has been defined. And when we are talking about dynamic environment, then we talk about the space where it has been used. Like for this function, it has been defined over here, but it's used over here. like it's been called over here. So it's called on the window. So this is the place where it's called. So we will consider this particular thing as if we are talking about dynamic environment or dynamic scoping. There is a slight difference between the two terminologies, but let's not make it what a complex topic over here. Let's talk it as a simple way, and let's define it over here like this. So in this scenario, a is having the accessibility within this function as per what we have discussed till now. So that means a will be accessible over here. But what about here? Will that a will be accessible outside this function? So for that scenario, let's run this particular function and see what the outcome comes. So when we run it, we can see that inside of foo, the value has been returned. That means the value has been shown. That means a is accessible within this particular foo. But let's see what happens when we're trying to run this one. Then what happened is that it's saying that a is not defined. That means a over here is not defined in particular environment. It's always defined in this particular function environment. So that means the scope of this variable a is within this function, in this particular function, not within the particular window. So if this a was defined outside the particular function, it will be accessible within this particular environment, and somehow it's also accessible within this foo also. And if you might be thinking that why, then it's a closure property implemented over there. So to understand the closure property, you can browse to my channel and see the other videos for closure. I can give the link in my description, and you can follow up accordingly. Now for this scenario, we talk about one topic, is that variable a has a particular scope, and its scope has been defined within this particular function. Now let's talk about one more thing. Let's go one step ahead, and now let's see what will happen next. So here one more thing I'm introducing over here is this. This is actually you don't have to worry about this for now, because it's a separate topic which we can discuss later on. So what this indicates over here, it will give a particular context for which it's talking about. Let's say when we are talking about this particular scenario, so it will tell you that in which context we are currently looking into. So instead of talking about more about this thing, let me give you the overview of the outcome, that what will it show. So over here, as what you can see, we already talk about window, like for a particular global on this particular browser, for global instance we have a window scope. So the window environment is there. So window will be this over here. So this is the context. So window is the context over this scenario. So when we are going for seeing outside the foo, the context is window. And what about inside the foo? This function inside also is telling that window is the scope, particular environment. Why it's just the same scenario over here? The same scenarios over here like this, that there the difference comes like between the scope and environment. Environment is the place at which the things has been defined, and scope is particular for a particular variable or function. What is the limitation and what is the what context in which it can be defined of, means it can be used. So over here, let me talk about this. So this and this is similar, just because this foo is also defined in a window environment. So it's not defined in other environment has not changed. So that's why this has the same value as the outside this. So now you might be having a question like, in which scenario it will change. So let me come ahead and show you the next example. where you can see over here, yeah, this one, where you can see now in this context we can see that this belongs to window. That means it's globally in this particular Windows environment. But when I talk about this function, this function is surrounded within this object, and this object creates its own separate environment, and this foo belongs to that environment. So in a particular, if somebody will give you a question and you have to understand it and try to come up with the difference between the lexical scoping and this particular dynamic scoping, then you might be thinking about the point like, if you want to talk about the things like you have to talk about two scenarios. One is where it has been defined, and second is how it's been called. Like when we are talking about this scenario, object is particular context on which this foo is belonging to. That means foo belongs to object. So this obj. So this object obj is the environment for that particular function foo, not the window. Before it was window, but right now it is within the particular context of object. So this object is the coming in the layer, and it's trying to telling you that, see, this foo belongs to object is no longer belonging to window. So what will happen? So over here, this console log will eventually give you the context, like in which context we are talking about. So right now when you are talking about this line, we are talking about the context of window, and let's say we are talking on this line, which context we are talking about. So by default it will take one level. So this level of this particular context is belonging to object context rather than Windows context. So what the outcome will be there? Let's see the outcome. So now you can see the inside of foo is belonging to foo. Inside of the foo is belonging to a function which is obj over here. So this function is this object is over there. This object is the environment. This object is a context for which this foo is defined. And when we talk about this which is outside the particular function or outside the particular object, so this will belongs to window. So I hope that you have some little idea about what's the difference between these two scenarios. So now the question comes, why we are talking about these things? We were talking about arrow function, but we end up talking about this topic, talking about lexical scoping and all those things. But let me collect all those points and let me clear one thing to you. Like, there used to be scenario where you want to use a particular context of your window or a particular outer scope to or a particular outer context, and want to use it in the inner context. And there will be a lot of scenarios when you're talking about working in JavaScript environment. There will be some scenarios where you really want to do it. So there comes the arrow function useful to you. Now let me show you how. So let me comment out this one and let me show you a scenario where this how come you can make that possible? Like, how come you can make this to point the global one rather than pointing the inner one, that this function, this object is, you are trying to come up with a solution to somehow allow it to point the window environment. So how can we do it? So this is the way where arrow function is come handy. What arrow function over here, when we are changing this function from normal function to arrow function, one interesting thing happening over here. That interesting thing is this particular function will take the outer world context also it's to itself. That means when we are talking about arrow function, then it's not just useful for implementing a function, it's also doing one more extra thing, which is taking the global this context to this particular function and allowing it to use that. So that means if we want to use this particular this, which is the window, in this particular function which belongs to some a separate context, then we have to use this arrow function. So using this arrow function, it will be helpful to uh, just not use this object context and to use the windows context. So this is very interesting thing. Right now you might be thinking about the need for this one, but I will tell you that in a lot of scenarios when you're working on JavaScript, it will be needful, and it will really help you if you are doing it with syntax like this, like ESA syntax. You would like to use this particular scenario. This is because this is so common use case. That's why they have implemented it ESA syntax. So this, let me run this one and let me show you what the outcome will be talking about. So here you can see the outside one is outside of foo is window. This belongs to window, and inside also we can see this belongs to window. That means this outside world is getting what included over here for this. That means that this is passed to particular inside this. So the context of this particular this passed to the context of this particular this, so that we can use that particular outside world in this function. Now you might be thinking that what context it's helpful for. So let me show you in one case. In this scenario, it will be more clear in this scenario what's happening out there. So let's say on our global this, which is our window, we have a variable b whose value is 5. So what I'm trying to do is that I want to use this particular value in this particular function foo. If we are using normal function, this belongs to this object, so it won't be possible to using it from outside world. So let me show you this particular running by this. Let me run this and show you how it's working. So when you run it, you can see that inside the foo you cannot see the value of this dot b, because what happening is that is thinking that let me find where is b. So it find in this particular context only. So in this context, for this particular context, b was not defined, so it will tell undefined. So this is where the arrow function will be helpful. Now let me show you. Now you can see over here that now you can see when we are implementing arrow function, this b will be accessible inside, because this belongs to the window rather than belonging to that object. So let me run this, and you can see over here this inside the foo value of b is able to accessible, and we can see the result over here. So this is how everything works over here. There's one more thing you might be thinking of, like when there was no ES6 syntax and there was only ES5 syntax, then what was the way to implement this thing? Like how can we use this in ES5 syntax rather than using arrow function? So there is one interesting answer to it, that we used to do bind, and we used to bind a particular environment to a particular function, so that to a particular function call, so that it will be taking the context of whichever thing which we are needing rather than using the actual context. So let me show you over here with that example. Let's say let me comment out this, and let me show you in this scenario. As you can see, it's a normal function. It was giving error. It was giving undefined for this particular value of b. But let's say you don't have arrow function and you want to implement it like ES5 syntax, then what you can do? So the simple thing you can do over here, like calling this foo simply will not help you as a particular scenario. So here you have to bind this particular instance, so that it a particular context, so that it will include that context and it will use that context instead of using the object context. So let me show you how. So let me try to explain you this, and let me try to show you how it can work without using arrow function. So as you can see over here, when we are calling this function, we won't directly call this function, we will use a bind. So foo dot bind, and then we will pass this particular instance, this particular context for scenario. And what bind used to do is that it return a particular function. So we will store that function. Let's say we store in boo, and then we call this boo. Then what eventually happens is that this particular thing will return a function, and we are calling that function, and we are trying to bind this over here to foo. So this foo now will having the context of the global, which is window in this scenario. So let me show the outcome. So now you can see inside foo 5 has been defined. So the result is able to display. Don't get confused with this one. Let me show you this changing with value as 6, so that it won't get confused with. So now you can see 5. So that means this value belongs to over here, this b's value. So that's all. So I hope that you could understand how the ES6 syntax arrow function works, and even what is the use case for that particular thing, and how to come up with the solution without using arrow function if you are needful for that. And secondly, even you are using arrow function, what's the purpose for using arrow function. So that's all for this particular video. Thank you very much.